Hi, DES570. I'm going to jump right into my adventures into the world of book design, photography, and the world of marine algae. And I just want to reiterate that this is kind of a story about the journey more than the work itself. So it's really about the adventure, and we will start it right here. So I often I'll talk a little bit about, where I am now. I often give talks. I gave a talk just the other evening to the California Native Plant Society. I'll give a talk next in a couple of weeks to a library group. And my mission and my goal in making the books, producing the artwork, designing all sorts of other related uh, installations and objects and such is to bring the world of marine algae, the seaweeds and kelps of our Pacific coast to a kind of unsuspecting audience, or perhaps naturalists who are familiar with the flora, our terrestrial flora, but have no idea what's going on out there, out underneath the waves, because it's a little bit hidden to most of us. So this is usually how my talks begin. And one of the installations that I did a couple of years ago was in a gallery in Alameda, the island of Alameda, where I used these curtains that I made that were kind of an offshoot of the shower curtains that I had been producing at the time. And the shower curtains are 72 inches by 60 inches. And I thought, I can use that same ripstop fabric that is so good for the shower curtains and produce some bigger curtains that are 94 inches tall, and they're very easy to design within space, especially when light can come through them. So usually when I'm doing a talk that's kind of seaweed related, I name all of the seaweeds: erythrophyllum and egregia and palmaria and the macrocystis or giant kelp, because that naming is part of the process of getting to know these organisms. But I'm going to leave it at that and run through this a little bit more quickly. Another opportunity I had to bring these seaweeds to kind of an unsuspecting audience was the Alameda Arts Commission asked a number of artists to fill the empty storefronts of an underused shopping center in Alameda. And I, again, put these curtains, this is the great macrocystis or giant kelp, into the windows of a video store that, needless to say, had been empty for many years. And then there was a whole festival that happened. There was music performances and children's performances and dancing and food trucks, and watching the passersby encounter these oversized kelps and seaweeds was really it was fun. It was rewarding. So another one of my favorite opportunities is when I am asked by scientists to collaborate with them, and this was an opportunity that the Northeast Algal Society offered me to do some kind of installation in the gallery space where they were holding their yearly conference. And their mantra for the conference was broaden your impact. That is, get the research that you're doing on these particular algae and seaweeds and kelp. How do you get it out to a wider audience beyond the scientists themselves? And so the seaweed world of scientists, they're called phycologists, are actually extremely welcoming of me as a writer and as an artist to help get their stories kind of disseminated in different ways. So again, I use these big curtains. It was kind of an odd space. And so how is it that I can make these big, large scale 94-inch prints? They're actually made by dye sublimation printing with a very fun fabricator right in South San Francisco, who unfortunately is having a terrible time through the shutdown. But they're dye sub onto ripstop fabric, and so they're very light, easy to ship, and relatively easy to hang. But I have to have a lot of resolution to print at 94 inches tall and 60 inches wide. And this is my tool that I use for producing the imagery of the seaweeds and kelps and other things like the beach stones, like you see here, that have not only gone into the books that I have designed and created, but go into large fine art prints. They go into packaging. I've done some packaging imagery for a line of seaweed-based skincare. I have done an architectural commission, and it all is because I can generate the images with this flatbed scanner at a very high resolution. I also can capture the translucency of the seaweeds. And how I do that is I actually take this white covering off of the top element there that's called the transparency adapter. And underneath that white cover, there's a second light element, a second plate of glass. And when I close down that top without the cover on and I scan in transparency mode, it actually pushes light through the object as the scan is being captured. And it's designed to scan slides and negatives and other transparencies. And I figured, well, if it can scan those kinds of things, it can scan objects like pieces of seaweed. Um, and so how did I get to seaweed itself? Um, well, I really have always been a walker of the beach, a beach walker. I always have collected things from the beach, and I wanted to be more involved with sustainability efforts, surveying the beaches. And so I took it upon myself to become a docent for the Duxbury Reef up in Bolinas, just up in Marin. And so I was doing a class being taught by a scientist from the Academy of Sciences, and we were all up on the reef. This was back in 2009 or so, when I was actually building my Beach, a Book of Treasure book, which we'll see in a second. And everyone was looking at all of the critters, the nudibranchs and limpets and sea urchins and starfish and little fish, but nobody was talking about what I saw the most of, which was the seaweed. And I happened to hold a scrap up to the sky, and this is what I saw: this incredible translucency, incredible color, these forms that layered on top of each other. And so I was determined to get that scrap and some other scraps back to my scanner in the studio. And this was one of the first really major images that I made from those scraps from the Bolinas Reef, the Duxbury Reef. And this fantastic color, fantastic shape, but the overlaying that the seaweeds do upon each other, this transparency, and that I could capture this transparency with my scanner so effectively, was just so thrilling, and then set me on this journey into the seaweeds. But what I realized a little while ago was that, in fact, I had been on this journey exploring transparency for actually a really long time. And I actually dug up some of my very early work to show you guys. This is an image of my undergraduate thesis. And what I did for I was in an art program at Harvard. It was called Visual and Environmental Studies. So I was mostly in the darkroom taking photography classes. I always had a photo class of some sort, whether it was large format, photojournalism, um, uh, all sorts of, I think I did a whole semester on using infrared film. So I was always in the darkroom, but alongside that, I was taking design classes and a graphic design and some other design courses. So for a thesis, I kind of brought these two areas together, and I designed these scale models of a carousel, a circus, and a parade, these kind of festivals of the city. And I photographed them and then designed these plexiglass constructions. It's actually very easy to cut and build with plexiglass. So I made this roundish shape for the carousel, which mimicked its architecture, and had these concentric circles spinning of the plexiglass panels that I layered my images on. I was printing the images on graphic arts film, which is transparent, and you can make it have this continuous tone. And then I made a circus. There was a circus in New York City that I went to go see. It was always in the same place in Lincoln Center, very much associated with New York City. It's called the Big Apple Circus. And I made this triangular structure you see on the left there that was mimicking the tent. And so I put the pictures of the tent. So it was all about looking through images to other images. And then I made the parade, which is the Macy's Day Parade, which goes right down Central Park West. So I made a long oblong structure that mimicked the avenue, and then layered in all of these transparent images once again. So that was my foray into transparency long ago. And then I had various jobs. I worked for a fabric design company when I got out of college, and then I worked for an architectural lighting design company, which was a really fabulous experience. I learned how to draft. I was working with architects and designing light systems for big commercial buildings, exteriors, residential, but I was working with architects and these other designers, and I had to interface with them through drawing. So I had to learn how to draft well, how to communicate. I have visual ideas. Um, and then I decided, but alongside all of that work, I was always photographing, and I was building these little light boxes out of plexiglass and doing a lot of workshops. And I decided to apply to grad school. So I applied to the photography department at San Francisco State, and that's where I went from 1991 to 93. And for my MFA project in 1993, I built this architectural space that was all about kind of my exploring domestic space. But again, I was using transparency. On one end was a glass block wall that was lit from behind, and I put these transparent images on the front and back of the glass block. So there was this interplay between these objects. I called them household ghosts. And on the other end was this big transparency of the garden side tomato can that was overlaid with the diary from my husband's grandmother, this very mundane accounting of a day. Picked tomatoes, canned 23 quarts tomato juice, covered flowers, first frost, clean kitchen cupboards, hemmed green dress, saw astronaut Gordon Cooper go into orbit, 22 is his goal, very windy. And that mundane nature, but blown up to scale. I even still have this garden side tomato can. I just think it's just this wonderful packaging. It's so simple and graphic. And I built a kitchen cupboard that had the light box behind it, so that this kitchen cupboard was on one side with this huge tomato can oozing out of it. And so that was my graduate thesis. And I again realized, like, this play of images behind images, or light coming through transparent objects, was something I was just fascinated by. And lo and behold, I'm still working with it with the seaweeds. But after I got out of grad school, I worked with two other colleagues to do a whole bunch of installation work around San Francisco. This was a big poster series for the Market Street Art and Transit program, sponsored by the San Francisco Arts Commission. And one of my partners had a very violent and tragic encounter where someone had broken into her house, and it was well, anyway, I hate to remember it, but it led us to kind of think about portraying the city as a little bit of a sinister place, with this play on all these saccharine lyrics from songs that everybody knew, but then to also make sure that people would encounter these images and be able to see all of the different groups that were doing so much good work in terms of reinvesting in the city: handgun control, women against gun violence, San Francisco women against rape, Parents' Place. So all of these, that was kind of a cool project. But what we were doing is grabbing these images off of VHF tape and digitizing them and working on the computer. So I was working in PageMaker, which was the precursor layout program to InDesign. So very early on, this is 1995, I was working digitally with imagery. So these were then output to transparencies and printed photographically. You can see the timing there if you look at that slide. Ooh, Clinton squeezed, and OJ's trial was going on. Well, that dates it there. So at the same time, because my partners and I we were applying for a lot of grants and for a lot of gallery shows, we realized we needed a scanner because we were working digitally. So we bought a scanner. It was kept over at my partner's house, Kathy's house, because I, at that point, probably had young children, having had my first in the middle of grad school and then had a second one shortly after I got out of grad school. So I was doing a lot of laundry, and I bought this used dryer which had this circular lint trap. And as I did all this laundry and cleaned off my lint trap, this pile of these lint circles collected on this shelf next to this, on the little back porch of my apartment. And something prompted me to take this pile of these circles of lint over to Kathy's apartment where we had the scanner, and to put them on the scanner. And this was one of those kind of aha moments where everything changed for me. And I realized that the scanner was this incredible tool to capture the true color and this nuance of detail, and this kind of elimination of background, of scale, even to let these objects of my world speak for themselves. And so this was the first example of that. And that's what I started doing. The scanner really gave me a way to keep making artwork with the chaos of young children around me, and to explore everyday objects. And I then started building a book. And over the next 10 years or so, I built these collaged images of the objects of my world, and I paired them with these very personal but pared down anecdotes about life as a mother. And I had been feeling, I was very aware of these extremes of emotion that were unlike anything I had ever experienced before in dealing with young children. So I made this book called Loving Blind, Seeing Red, A Mother's Decade. And it was exploring the book format. It was exploring bringing word and image together, and using my scanner to capture these objects, and to try to keep it not so, there being kind of a remove. The images I thought were very cool and very universal, whereas the text was quite personal and intimate. So that contradiction was trying to play with this idea of the contradiction of emotions that I was talking about. And again, my scanner was really the tool of choice for finding these things. This is just a really typical piece that I wrote called Decipher: What Goes On in Their Heads, What Provokes the Bouts of Screaming Fits, Reversions to Baby Talk, Sudden Outbursts of Loud and Bizarre Noises, and Unwarranted Crying. I wish I could split them open like a squash and be reassured by lovely smooth flesh and not tangled seeds and muck. So any parent kind of understands that a little bit. So this book, I actually, this book here, I'll go back here, I had made as an artist book. I worked with a local printer. Again, it was kind of made as a fine art book. I had 3 copies made, and I took one of them to a meeting with a local book packager and editor. And I also took with me a little mock-up that I had made of a series of stones, a series of beach stones that I had made into an accordion book with stones on each side. So there were 6 stones one way and 6 stones the other way. And I took that little maquette with my fine art book of Loving Blind, Seeing Red. And I had a meeting with a book packager who had just moved from Chronicle Books to work for herself. And she said, I am going to the big book expo in about 3 weeks, and I'm happy to take this artist book that you've got of Loving Blind, Seeing Red, but I also want to take that little stone book, but I want you to make that into a better book proposal, build it out into a full-fledged book. And what I did was I just made this very simple collection of single stones, and I made it into 50 stones, and I just made a counting. I put a number on the opposite page and called it 50 stones. And then I had a friend of mine who's a printer make 3 little really printed copies of this small book. And so this woman who turned into my book agent took that to the big book expo and sold it, the beach stones, not the mom book. Nobody seemed interested in that one. But the beach stone she sold to Abrams, which was just shifting from being called Harry Abrams to Abrams Books. It's one of the foremost illustrated book publishers. So very early on, as I worked with the editor-in-chief there, we decided to make it a series of 3 books. And it turned into a series of 3 books that were decided early on to be this 7 by 7 inch format. And so the beach stones was the first one, and I was paired with a writer, Margaret Carruthers, a wonderful science writer, a geology writer, and then I came up with other science writers for the Leaves and Pods and the Seashells books. But I worked with a single editor, and the editor and I really shaped these books. Even though there were different writers, I was very much the author of the books. I was the conceptual driver, and it all started with my image making using my scanner. So I would make images of the stones, or the seashells or the leaves, and then I would pass those images off to the writer and say, why is there this white line through the stones? And then that's what would spark the scientific writing. But I made sure that the tone stayed very, very lyrical, and very understandable to the lay reader, kind of simplified. So here you can see, this is what I revel in, is just these objects being caught, that just that crack in that backside of the leaf, and the lovely feeling of this beach stone. This is really what my scanner allows me to achieve. So these objects are scanned as a reflective scan. So I leave the top open of my scanner, and the light is reflecting off the object, just like it would reflect off a document if you were scanning a photograph or a document. And with the top open, the light has nothing to reflect off of, so the background defaults to black. And I pull these into Photoshop. I make the black background very black. I get rid of all the dust. But the other thing about the scanner is the color is very, very true to the object. So I don't have to play with color. And then the workflow into InDesign is very seamless. So I make these TIFF files, I downsize them to be appropriate for my book design, and then I get to work right into InDesign. And the Leaves and Pods book really got me exploring, really pushing the edges, going full bleed, crossing the gutter, really taking these objects and looking at them objectively, like you have with this pin oak leaf on the right, and then looking at them even closer still. And what are the questions that come up? What's up with this primary, secondary, tertiary vein system that's going on here? And what about this concave shape that is so extreme in this leaf? And those questions went off, in this case, to Mary Ellen Hannibal, who then would write about it. So there was this correlation between text and image. And the seashells, I was very lucky. I got to go into the Academy of Sciences to explore their fossil and shell collection. I also used my grandmother's collection of shells, which gave this intimacy to the collection. But of course, again, this flamboyancy, what is the story behind that with these ammonite shells? And then after those 3 books came out, I realized that many, many people were telling me that they had friends who collected heartstones. And I thought, oh, I can make a quick little book just about heartstones. So I made this little book. It was just 5 by 5 inches when it was originally published. And then it came out in a second edition as 6 by 6 inches. And I think it's gone through 13 or 14 printings. It sold a couple 100,000 copies at least. It keeps going and chugging along. But I came up with a very simple formula for the sequencing of the book, whereby I paired one word about love with a single stone, but then every 3 pages, I would create a double page spread. So there's a rhythm to the book, and that's something I've really worked on for each book, is this rhythm and sequencing that's so important. This was what I wanted to do next, which was use more objects and to talk about everything you find at the beach. So I made a book using material like this. This was one of the very first images that I used in the proposal. And those pods there, I had no idea what they were when I made this image, but they turned out to be seaweed pods. And I was so taken by their color and their organic shape. But this gave rise to this book, Beach, A Book of Treasure. And again, the trim size was determined first. This was published by Chronicle Books. I have a copy of it here. I spent lots and lots of time coming up with this 11 by 7-inch trim size, which gives me an overall spread. I can't even fit it in the window there, of 22 inches. So 22 by 7 inches is the big full page spread. And it allowed me to design the page in all of these kind of different ways. And that horizontality mimicked the horizontality of the beach itself. And so this was a book where I could actually write the book myself. It was 2009, and the internet was starting to be so much more accessible to someone like me to really dig into the science. And so I could create these 2 and 3 paragraph, not blurbs, but sections about the science of sand dollars or sea urchins, or how is sea glass made. And this is the book where I started exploring seaweed. I did my very first seaweed workshop with a wonderful woman named Kathy Ann Miller. And she is the curator of algae over at UC Berkeley. And I did every 2 years, I would do another one of these 3 to 4 day workshops somewhere else along this coast of California. And so the Beach, a Book of Treasure, it has that first image on the back, and it has the first images of seaweed and the first writings about seaweed. In fact, I write about Anna Atkins relative to her seaweed collection in Beach, a Book of Treasure. So as soon as this book came out in 2010, I knew I wanted to continue exploring the seaweeds. They were an undertold story. Nobody was talking about seaweed in 2010. And they're the primary producers of our oceans. They're extraordinarily important, and they're so pervasive. If you just go out onto the beach or onto the rocky coast, that's what's there, and no one was writing about them, or no one was making images of them. So I very quickly made another proposal, worked on another proposal for a book called An Ocean Garden, The Secret Life of Seaweed. And I sent it off to my publisher at Abrams, my editor, and he sent it to the salespeople, and they all just said, no way, there's no way we can sell a book on seaweed. So they rejected it. And so I decided in the interim, while I kept working on the seaweed book, I wasn't going to let it go. The images were way too beautiful. And this was one of the very first spreads I made. It was just so Marimekko-ish to me, this design element, and the way the seaweeds let me design on the page was something I wasn't going to let go. But in the meantime, to actually get another book into the works, I suggested another little book of sea glass, and in particular sea glass hearts. And I knew I could scan the sea glass both ways with my scanner. This way is using the reflective technique, where the light is bouncing off the sea glass and makes it look a little bit like a frosty stone. Or I could scan it pushing light through using the transparency adapter and capture that gem-like quality that's a little bit more like when you encounter it on the beach at the edge of the water. And I wrote a whole little poem that was kind of like part science, part walking the beach that went with it. And that was Sea Glass Hearts. And that was published in 20, I don't know what, maybe 2015 or something like that. And then 2 years later, I proposed an ocean garden again to Abrams, and they accepted it this go round. And this is where I started writing much more deeply about the science of the seaweed. And yet I was reading a lot of Rachel Carson. I was very much trying to keep her kind of voice on my shoulder as I wrote about the seaweed, because I was very aware that the jargon that came along with the science that I was learning was words that I had not understood myself early on, because I'm not trained in the sciences. So I was very careful to write for someone like myself without using the jargon, to find other words. But I did want to name the seaweeds wherever I could. So this is this fabulous Bonmaisonia californica. And again, the scans using my scanner gave me all this opportunity to work with the page with text and image. So these are just some spreads from that first iteration of the Ocean Garden. And so I would send the InDesign file with the all the images placed and the text placed, but only in a rough way. And then I would work with the designer at Abrams, or with the newer book I'm going to talk to you about with the designers at Heyday. And that collaboration with the designers was really wonderful. The designers at Heyday, when I made my first books, the Beach Stones and the Seashells and the Leaves and Pods book, had never actually received an InDesign file from an author before. That had never been done. Usually they would receive a Word manuscript and a bunch of TIFF files, and then the designer there would have to put it together and come up with a system. So they were excited by that. It saved them so much time. And I actually got some design fees with that, which made the whole enterprise a little bit more worthwhile. So this was a great way for me on this page to explain the architecture of seaweed, these basic elements of the holdfast, the stipe, and the blade, using this wonderful colander kelp. So I'm going to just kind of, move a little bit more quickly here. What I'm showing you on the left is the wonderful erythrophyllum, and this is this straightforward portrait that was very much a part of that book, The Ocean Garden. But I started exploring with the scanner these collaged elements, and this was actually in response to being very inspired by Rex Ray, the artist that I have sent you guys to get to know through my visit to a last exhibit of his. And I thought I can use my seaweed as the organic element to collage with. And so that's what I have on the right here. And that's what I'm doing here with this fantastic Halosacyon or sea sacs. So when I get to this slide in my presentation for other groups, I start talking about how these organisms survive in the intertidal zone, which is a world that's so different from our own. And in the case of these sea sacs, they hydrate from within. They have little ocean universes within them to succeed the long drying hours of low tide when the tide goes out. And I try to point out how different their existence is than anything that we recognize here on Earth. And this is one of my favorite kelps, the feather boa kelp, or Egregia menziesii. And this was a specimen I found at Fort Funston. It's the walk I do all the time. I get out to Fort Funston as much as I can. And this, I got onto the scanner when it was still kind of wet and had its fabulous form and color. And then I started making cyanotypes because I had researched Anna Atkins. She's very much a part of the history of the science of seaweed. And she made the very first photographically illustrated book. And she made them using cyanotype. She called them cyanotype impressions. She made cyanotype prints of her seaweed collection. On the East Coast, on the English coast. She did that first book in about 1840. So she was very much in the Victorian era, and she was very much of a polymath. She had to understand the chemistry of cyanotype printing. She needed to be a naturalist to collect the seaweeds and understand them and name them. And then she was an artist. She used the cyanotype printing process to kind of explore some personal expression. So I do it in my backyard. I coat the paper in my basement here with the chemistry that becomes light sensitive. I can expose with my specimens out in my backyard. And then I realized that actually my scanning of the specimens was operating in this lineage of what's called nature printing, which is where prints are made from the specimen themselves. It's not like a botanical illustration, or a photograph. It's really using a particular specimen to make the print, which is what a cyanotype does. It makes the shadow of the specimen. And I realized I could take my scan of the same specimen and lay it into the shadow that had been made in the cyanotype. And of course, I scanned the cyanotype so I could do this layering within the computer. And this interplay between my specimen, in this case, the fabulous red seaweed called Opuntiella, and its shadow in the cyanotype was this wonderful dialogue. And it was not only this interplay of the object and its shadow, but also this interplay across time of a historic technique combined with my very contemporary technique of using the scanner. And here's another one of the beautiful Maziella, and this is an image that makes up the introductory image for the chapter on seaweed color, which is in my newest book, The Curious World of Seaweed. And I use this image as this introductory page, which is, again, this design device that I use throughout this book, where each chapter has this double spread kind of introduction. And in the chapter on color, I'm very much talking about this red and blue pigment that the red seaweeds have, and they combine into this incredible purple, as it's illustrated right here with this Maziella. This is a slide that I use whether I'm talking to school children or adults who are scientists, to explain the taxonomic groups, the evolutionary lineages of the seaweeds, which fall into this red, green, and brown. And I go into, again, the pigmentation. The greens are what gave rise to our plants on land, and they just have chlorophyll, and that is that story. And then I also was very interested in this history of the science, and I realized that the taxonomic, or the history of the science of seaweeds, had these beautiful images, this visual component to it. So these are 4 really classic kelps that everybody can find out on our California coast. And again, I thought, oh, I want to talk across time and layer my contemporary scan onto these historic images. And that this talk across time, this is nori, in fact, or pyropia. And so this is super common, and it's laid onto this lithograph by a wonderful, wonderful artist named Alexander Postels from, again, the 1840s or so. And these images were my research. In fact, they were the driving force to my research into the history of the science that very much makes up the written essays of this book. And these essays are much longer than anything I've ever written before. This is that ulva or sea lettuce again. And this is the Stephanocystis, this wonderfully graphic golden kelp that you find very often on the beaches, especially at Stinson Beach, and it's paired with its lithograph from that historic publication. And this was an image that was chosen by the art director and the designer at Heyday Books for the cover of the book. And my collaboration with the art director and the designer at Heyday Books was just fantastic. They loved that I had worked out this sequencing of images as I built the book. And so each of these books, I'm building images on the scanner, I'm bringing them into InDesign, I'm working on these layouts as I go along. And that determines like the chapter sequencing and so much more. And so they have a huge amount of the work has already been done when they receive the material as designers. And then they get to do all the refining, which I'm no good at. I'm not good at the grids and the, making everything absolutely, and the headers and footers and all the rest. And they made this beautiful cover. It's embossed. And so the whole book has this fabulous feel to it as an object. And so there were 16 chapters with an introduction. And so each of these is about a 2,000 to 3,000 word essay. It was heavily researched. I got to introduce all these pioneering women scientists, which was very important to me. There's almost 1 per chapter. So their stories are very, very much a part of this book. And so it was again, a deeper dive into a writing project than I had ever done before. And I also used historical material for the first time. So this is the story of the bull kelp, which is a very important story for our north coast of California, because this is the foundational kelp of those kelp forests, and it's going away, it's disappearing. So it's this a very kind of important ecological story that those of us who live in California need to know. And in telling its life history, it's an annual, so it has a lifespan of just about a year, where it starts with these babies. I use these historical documents as well, these historical pressings. So there's all sorts of levels to this book that and clues. This was an image I made as kind of an homage to the kelp that is kind of going away up on the north coast. There's lots of work, just so you know, going on in kelp restoration right now, partly because of all this storytelling that I've been doing with a bunch of other people. There's this huge focus on the kelp, and a lot of money is going into science and researching restoration efforts. So I'll show you just some of the other elements to this book. The coralline algae is very, very important. This is algae that actually calcifies like a shell in its cell walls. So I'm able to capture this using my scanner in the reflective mode, in what I call its traditional mode. And you have this encrusting coralline and this articulated coralline algae, which is in fact in the red category of seaweeds, and that's why it's all pink. And the seagrasses are a super important story as well. They are not algae, they are in fact plants. And the Zostra marina is very foundational to our estuaries and bays. There's lots of research going into that. And then more recently, I've just been making these collaged elements using my highest res files. In fact, this is an image and the next one that was made right at the beginning of the shutdown when I had to cancel all of these events that were going to happen. I was doing this huge trip up to the Pacific Northwest with book talks and workshops and art exhibits and all sorts of stuff just shut down. So I started making sure I had the highest res files well archived of all of my seaweed work. And as I was archiving it, I thought, well, why don't I just start making these really big murals out of this, out of collaging with them. And so these are designed as these enormous, 75-inch by 62-inch mural images. So again, the process of archiving can be hugely beneficial. And then this, if you've gone to my website and looked at the video on the home page, I worked with a videographer to work with these very high-res images to make a video introduction to the book, which has been super, super useful. And you can see that these, in fact, all of these have a different color palette. And it's because they are all scanned when they were still wet. So they're scanned fresh off the beach. And then that's kind of it. Here I am. These are the books that I've created. There's another book in the works, but it's again, it's based on this image, which I call Chasing Kelp, which is again where I've laid in a scan of the blades of this bull kelp into this cyanotype. I've actually printed this oriented vertically at maybe 8 feet tall. It hung in the Great Highway Gallery for a show that I did there. And I think that's it. So ask me questions at office hours. If you have questions, email them to me, but I hope I see you at office hours. I had a wonderful time giving this talk to a group of you a little while ago. So please be in touch, and I'll see you very soon.